Good evening, everybody. My name is Brett Jans. And Khalil, are you going to introduce me or would you like me to introduce myself?
Up to you.
Okay. Um, Khalil was kind enough to ask me if I'd be willing to share some of my experience and research that I've done with a few different things in ag and on our farm and with the job that I previously had, and also my thoughts and bit of a my perspective on some of the future outlook we have on a few different things that we're managing in agriculture. So, depending on when you want me to get going, Khalil, I can switch over to the PowerPoint presentation.
Go ahead, please.
Excellent. I will do that now. Start screen share. Share screen. Share. How are we looking there?
Awesome.
Okay, I'll minimize that. Move that out of the way. How's that?
Looks good.
How's the view? Excellent. As I said, my name is Brett Jans. I'm a certified crop advisor and an agrologist in training. I farm with my family at New Norway, Alberta. We try to maintain a 4-year rotation with pulses, cereals, and canola. I'm also an agronomist with Point Forward Solutions and an agronomist with Diverge Business Development. There's a picture of my wonderful family that I've been blessed to have, and a little bit of information about me. I went to the U of S, have my Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, and previously, before going full-time farming this past year, I was the agronomy lead for the Crop Management Network. So two things that are definitely passions of mine is integrated pest management and sustainability of the soil. Personally, just started cross-country skiing this winter, which I think every single person in Canada started with the way our social management of our networking system got reorientated, and also because it was extremely difficult to try to find cross-country skis. I also joined the volunteer firefighter department, which I think you have to be obligated to do. And I manage the Timber Growing Project, a Canadian Food Grains Bank initiative with the community of Edinburgh. All right, a little bit of information about what I would like to talk about and go over today. And if there's anybody online who has any questions, do not hesitate to type them in or speak at any point. Part one, I'd like to go over some things about calcium and gypsum. And my goal of that portion of the presentation is to get farmers that are listening in or agronomists to think about, is gypsum a fit for their land, for their soil, for their farm? Next component part I want to talk about is, and these are pretty much two things that are very important to me, is soil sustainability and management of nutrients in soil, and integrated pest management, number one being weed management. Part two, I'd like to talk about some things that are happening with herbicide resistance management. And my goal of that portion of the presentation is what I would like to have some of these agronomists or farmers take away from that is to try to start thinking outside the box about what they can do in a proactive way to prolong the reliability of the herbicides that we're using right now. So first and foremost, some of the benefits of calcium. Bit of a busy slide here for those of you who'd like to read on the PowerPoint. I've got a whole bunch of different points there. And for those of you who are more of the audio-based learning, what I'd like to just express is 2 points, being that calcium is a plant nutrient, but it's also a soil structure component, among many other things. But those are the primary important roles of calcium. So another point that I'd like to come across that I want to bring together later is as we apply ammonium-based fertilizers, you are adding hydrogen ions to the soil, which is over time causing an acidity or an acidifying effect of the soil. If you've got high pH soils, this is likely a good benefit to you. But for myself and majority of the soils that I've worked with, we are ranging from a pH of 5 to 5.5 on our farm. And there's lots of farms out there that are in that exact same range, if not lower. And so the acidification process is something that's going to be affecting us, especially when it comes to nutrient availability, as I'm referencing the pH and how nutrient tie-up is affected by it. Which, if you haven't seen that chart before, hopefully this isn't the first time you've seen it, because that's a very important part of managing nutrients. Another thing I'd like to talk about with some of the benefits of calcium is disease management. Back in 2018, I was fortunate enough to attend the International Clubroot Workshop held in Edmonton, which was people put together from all over the world managing diseases that affect brassica-based crops, which once you start researching and learning about the amount of crops that are affected by clubroot, it's actually phenomenal, the amount of different crops that I never even knew were either existed or that they were susceptible to clubroot. It's not just canola. Canola is quite actually, canola and winter oilseed rape are quite a small portion of that, with a lot of higher value crops being affected by clubroot. And a lot of the talk there and a lot of the research at that time was being focused on liming the soil and increasing the amount of calcium content of the soil to try to reduce the amount of clubroot infection in the plants. And this picture on the left-hand side was some research that was done in correlation with Graymont and the Canola Council on a field that had significant clubroot issues in clubroot-resistant varieties. What was done was a high rate of hydrated lime was applied to the soil and then incorporated. And one of the agronomists, Keith Gaubert from the Canola Council, went out and planted some clubroot resistant varieties in and out of these lime trials. And we found within 1 year of application that 10,000 pounds per acre, clubroot infection was almost totally reduced in a susceptible or in a variety that, and this is in this picture, it's the same variety on both sides there. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the Phanomyces and how that seems to be having a correlation with calcium management in the soil. Now, this is all based on low pH soil. If you get into high calcium, high pH soils, I don't have any experience in managing those root diseases or those soil-borne diseases in those types of soils. Next thing I wanted to talk about was how calcium is a significant component of good soil structure. Now, this image on the left shows how your sand, silt, and clay will form to make a nice soil aggregate, and I'm going to go over that terminology a little bit more. And then on the right-hand image, I wanted to just point out how such a large portion of Alberta, especially in the high crop production zones, are managing high sodium content soils, or not necessarily solenitic always, but saline soils. And so it's kind of interesting. Every farmer you talk to has either a gumbo field or a gumbo portion, or parts of their field are gumbo. And every single farmer has the worst gumbo. So no matter where I go and no matter what farmer I talk to, he has the worst gumbo on his farm. It's kind of interesting how that works, but those gumbo zones are likely high in sodium, causing them to have very poor soil structure and not be able to handle high moisture events or drought events. So some of the terminology here is flocculation. And this is the process where you're trying to get clay particles to form stable soil aggregates. And this is a benefit to the soil. Here's a little bit of a visual representation of that. Now, Khalil, I don't know if you can hear me or not. Should I answer some of these questions right now that are being typed in, or answer them afterwards?
It's up to you. If you want to answer now, you can go ahead, please.
So one of these questions come in: how does the economics of adding calcium look like compared to profitability? You know what? Actually, I will push that one off to the end because I got a slide that kind of matches up with that better. So talk about that a little bit later when it comes to the economics. Back to what I'm talking about here in the presentation is flocculation of soil particles and stable soil aggregates. So with a flocculated soil where you're able to form stable soil aggregates, you're going to have more pore space, more consistent soil structure that can withstand high moisture events, drought, everything like that, because of the fact that they'll have more pore space, which is going to allow the infiltration of water or retain the moisture once it's in the soil instead of ponding on top, compared to a dispersed soil structure where you don't have good stable aggregates. Those are the types of soils that are going to be easily compacted. And also in a wet and dry cycle, you're going to have that shrink swell effect, which is going to destroy all the pore spaces and reduce any chance of producing stable soil aggregates. Oh. So here's a bit of a numbers representation for those of you who prefer a number to try to understand how flocculation based on your nutrient or your cation is expressed. So the flocculating power is how that cation can offset the negative charge of the soil. So sodium having a really low flocculating power, it's only a single proton. It can't actually help to develop those stable soil aggregates and manage that negative charge of the soil, whereas calcium has a stronger positive charge and has a higher flocculating power to form those aggregates. Magnesium does to a certain extent, but the ability to maintain pore space within a high magnesium content soil is not very sufficient, not very effective in maintaining that stable soil aggregate. And you actually get a tight soil from high magnesium content, but not necessarily a good flocculated soil. It's just a very tight, very low pore space soil. Now, when it comes to calcium addition, there's two most common sources of calcium being calcitic limestone or your lime calcium carbonate. Many different forms of calcium sources that you can apply to your soil. One of the cheaper ones being cement kiln dust, a byproduct of the cement industry. And then if you ever hear anybody talking about a dolomitic limestone, this is going to be a high magnesium limestone. It's not very common here in Alberta, more in Manitoba and in Quebec and Ontario. They have high magnesium limestone sources, so dolomitic lime. And then the other portion of it, one thing I should mention is that as a source of calcium and the way that it affects the soil, your lime will increase your soil pH. Whereas your second source of calcium or separate source of calcium is gypsum. This is calcium sulfate. This has no effect on your soil pH whatsoever. And as we know, most commonly gypsum is utilized in drywall manufacturing. And so the gypsum, though, however, it does not affect soil pH. What its ability to improve your soil structure is that it will displace sodium from the cation exchange on your soil surface into the soil solution. So here's a bit of a representation on how it does that. A couple of images on high sodium content soils. Sorry if the quality isn't very good, but most importantly from this slide, what I want to represent is how calcium sulfate is applied to the soil, and on the soil cation exchange site, the calcium will displace the sodium into soil solution, and the sodium will form a, I don't know the technical science term there, sorry, it's evading me right now, with sulfur, and it will be a leachable, so it's going to stay in solution, a leachable sodium, so that you can move it out of the soil profile if you can get the water to move away from your oh, sorry, lost my train of thought there. Anyways, you leach the sodium out, which hopefully the gypsum will help you to leach the sodium out by having more stable soil aggregates. Here's an example of a gypsum product, Gyprich Prill. It's manufactured in in Kamloops, BC. It's a granular form of gypsum. There's many different types of gypsum that you can access. Shredded and screened drywall works. Not quite as easy to handle. You do need some equipment to manage that, so to be able to spread a very fine powder. There's other granular sources of gypsum on the market. This Gypsrich in particular, unfortunately, it's not a good enough quality to be able to apply through an air drill and seed place it. It would have to be broadcast through a spin spreader or a boom floater truck, which is where majority of the research that I've done with gypsum has been done with broadcast application and some seed place. So now gypsum as a sulfur source, not necessarily just a calcium nutrient, but also a sulfur source. So some of the research here, I pulled this slide on the left from Calcium Products based out of the States, good manufacturer of granular gypsum. They found that the sulfur release curve really matches up nicely with the sulfur uptake curve of canola. Now, canola generally needs a high amount of available sulfur rate as it converts from vegetative into reproductive. So this is just at the onset of bolting and flowering. That's where majority of your sulfur is taken up by the canola, and gypsum, as majority of the sulfur is released just at that time frame when it's applied in the fall or in the spring. So here's some research that was done out at Heisler, and on the left is 200 pounds per acre of seed placed gypsum right in with the canola seed with nothing else except for the canola seed. And this spot in particular in this field was white at the time of seeding, so very high sodium content. And on the right-hand side was just canola seed, no gypsum seed placed. And this was done at 200 pounds per acre. And we found definitely an improved plant stand, and because of that, more consistent plant stand and improved maturity. Conducted the same trial at just north of Camrose in some high sodium content soils. And I'd like to refer to the picture on the right here. And what that is shortly after seeding, the gypsum at 200 pounds per acre seed place had better emergence and more consistent emergence and earlier emergence than what the just canola seed or nothing with the canola seed in this particular trial. And from this exact same spot, we had earlier flowering, more consistent plant stand throughout the growing season compared to nothing seed placed on a canola. So naturally, I had to test it out on my own farm. What we did is in the fall or after harvest in 2018, we broadcast 30 pounds per acre of sulfur in strips with a boom floater using ammonium sulfate and gypsum. We used ESN just to manage the amount of nitrogen that was applied from the ammonium sulfate, so that the only variable was whether there was calcium present or not and the sulfur source. And in 2019, we found that there was no significant yield difference between ammonium sulfate or gypsum as a sulfur source. To me, that was good. I was hoping to see a yield improvement. Unfortunately, that was not the case, but I was glad to see that there was no yield reduction due to using gypsum as a sulfur source. Now, a lot of people that I've talked to and a lot of farmers over the years have asked, why would I broadcast sulfur? Well, we found that adding ammonium sulfate into our canola blends was causing us significant issues. Ammonium sulfate, it's really bad for bridging up inside the tank, caking on to your metering rollers or your metering augers, and it's most likely usually a dusty product, and any humidity whatsoever will give you some grief. So by pulling the sulfur source out of our fertilizer blends, we're able to gain a few more acres per fill, and then also not having to deal with the headache that sulfur was causing in our blends. I would like to point out that we did one strip at twice the application rate, and we did have a yield increase. So either that was the sulfur improvement, or perhaps just a higher rate of calcium was able to give us a bit higher yield benefit. The only difference that I found between ammonium sulfate and gypsum on canola was that there was a bit higher green count in the ammonium sulfate. The gypsum was drier canola and there was less green, but the yield was identical. Now, Garrett Whitworth with AIB Innovates conducted some gypsum trials with a few different products in combination to see what type of correlation can be had with gypsum and other products in particular. And what he found is that gypsum, in combination with potash, gave them the highest percent increase in yield. They also had better maturity with that. And this was in a broadcast form of granular gypsum. And they were using the rates of application, I think, were based on 20 to 30 pounds of sulfur. I'd have to double check the research, but they were able to maintain some variables and had a few different trials there to see what products would give the best results. So just to refer back, that gypsum is definitely a reliable source of sulfur that can be used for growing canola or other crops. Canola in particular, I think, is the best fit because of the fact that canola uses a lot of calcium, and also that slow release sulfur source matches up with your sulfur extraction out of the soil. So wrapping up, a few comments or just to wrap up on benefits of gypsum is the calcium will displace sodium to improve your soil structure. Hopefully that will give you more consistent, stable soil aggregates. You're going to flocculate your soil particles. It's a slow release sulfur source. It's a sulfur source that's not detrimental to your pH. And you're supplying your crop with calcium, which is important in managing soil-borne diseases. And to me, another important fact is that gypsum does not need to be imported. It's a very sustainable source of calcium and sulfur, as Rocky Mountains are limestone-based mountains. There's a significant amount of calcium and sulfur to be extracted there. And there's no need to import it from other parts of the world. So I would consider that quite a nice local source of nutrients. One thing I'd just like to finalize on why ammonium sulfate, if you have low pH soils. Now, this is just based on low pH soils. I don't have much experience with high pH soils, so I can't speak on that. But if you have low pH soils and you're wanting to manage that pH over the course of your farming career, ammonium sulfate will not necessarily reduce your pH because of the buffering capacity of your soil and the application rate that you're using is such a small amount. But when you think about how much ammonium sulfate you're applying over the course of a period of time, you need to remember that the rough math is for every pound of ammonium sulfate that you applied, you need 3 pounds of lime to offset that. So over a 30-year farming career, you're applying 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate every couple of years. That's going to add up on the amount of lime that you're going to have to apply just to offset that, to bring you back to what you would need to do at your current pH that you have today. So that's another reason why I thought if If I can get away from ammonium sulfate now and start using gypsum as my sulfur source, by the time I'm ready to retire, I will not have done any significant, I will have avoided one nutrient one fertilizer product that is doing me no benefit to the long-term health of my soil. But that's just kind of how I look at it a bit more long-term and why I think it's a sustainable source of sulfur. Now, on the economics of it, most of the time, depending on where ammonium sulfate falls in the market and compared to elemental sulfur, gypsum is going to be a bit of a premium sulfur source. It's not significantly more expensive, but if you have a soil pH that you'd like to learn more about and how to manage that, it also depends on if you have a high pH soil. So I think my next slide is questions. Here we go. So yes, now we can go to questions. So the first question is, how does the economics of adding calcium look like to profitability? Well, the only thing that I've proven is that that I haven't been able to see a yield increase in the first year of application with gypsum. However, right now, I think you can source granular gypsum for cheaper than ammonium sulfate based on a cost per pound of sulfur, because of the fact that ammonium sulfate's been on a bit of a run here with the markets. So when it comes to profitability, there is no significant yield gain that I've found in soils that are not sodium, that have high sodium. Where I did this trial on our farm, we're fortunate enough that it's a well-drained location with no significant sodium issues. However, if you have high sodium content, there's a good chance that ammonium sulfate is not doing you any significant benefit, that gypsum could actually be a better sulfur source. So if that answers your question, I hope it does. And then the next question is it recommended to add gypsum every year, and what is the value out of that? So this is where I wanted to refer back to this presentation here. This question here is, there's soil remediation, and then there's nutrient supply. So I put these two pictures up here. These are lime applications that you see spreading and all the dust is coming off. Those are in the thousands of pounds per acre. This is where you're trying to change the pH or the chemistry of your soil. Very high application rate, very cost intensive. Versus nutrient supply is where you're just trying to apply the amount of nutrients that your yield potential can utilize for your crop. So I placed this other picture in here, which is granular gypsum that's going to be going broadcast with an application rate of 30 pounds per acre of sulfur to supply the canola with sulfur. Sorry about that, forgot to put my phone on do not disturb there. Okay, if that answers that question. So adding gypsum every year definitely would be a good benefit to you if you have high sodium content soils, or you have low calcium levels in your soils and you'd like to supply your crop with calcium and sulfur. Definitely a lot of benefit to there. For me, I'm just using it as a sulfur source on our farm for canola. In the future, I could potentially look at seeing what kind of a response I can get from adding gypsum to pulse crops, because of the fact that pulses definitely need calcium to mitigate aphanomyces and improve soil structure, and also for nodulation. Calcium has been proven to be beneficial there, and sulfur is important to pulse crops. I haven't done that research yet. I hope to do that in the future. Okay, next question. Does gypsum also reduce clubroot infection rates like limestone? That has not been proven. However, now when we get into the, I'm going to get a little, hopefully I don't get too preachy here. Clubroot loves anaerobic soil conditions. So this is saturated soil conditions where they can infect canola plants that are in waterlogged or field capacity moisture conditions. If you apply gypsum and you improve the porosity of your soil, you flocculate those soil particles to form stable aggregates, improve water infiltration. You now are trying to reduce the time the soil is under anaerobic conditions. You're going to have aerobic conditions where you have airflow or air pockets in the soil. So, is gypsum going to reduce clubroot infections? Not directly the way that lime does, but it will improve aerobic soil conditions, which reduce the clubroot infection conditions. So directly, no, not how lime does. Indirectly, yes, it has potential to do that from my standpoint. Not a scientist, just based on soil theory and what it does to the soil. Oh, am I underselling the benefits of gypsum? Sorry, I don't mean to undersell the benefits of gypsum. I just don't want to get too preachy. I think there is tons of benefits of gypsum. If you type in gypsum for your soil on Google, you could go down a serious wormhole about all the different benefits that people find from gypsum, about slow release sulfur, how our plants evolved and formed over millennia to extract mineral-based nutrition, not synthetic-based, ammonium-based nutrition. So it's more natural. It's more, the plants are better designed to extract mineral-based nutrition, which gypsum's a great source of mineral sulfur. So, and when it comes to long-term benefits of the sustainability of the soil, I want to apply a product that's not going to decrease my pH. I think there's another benefit there, but I don't want to sell it too hard. I want people to do their own research, ask questions, find out if it's a fit on your own farm. Another question. How many sources available for gypsum? The source that I've been using is coming out of Kamloops. It's a granular gypsum that's ground into an extremely fine powder and then it's pearled again. Unfortunately, it's a bit too dusty. They're still working on the formulation to be able to put it through an air drill. So we use it in a broadcast application to apply it in the fall, which when it comes to the 4R nutrient management, ammonium sulfate broadcast in the fall, although not a significant risk of nitrogen loss, there is still some. Whereas when you're applying gypsum, there's no nitrogen to be susceptible to loss. It's not a readily available sulfur source in the fall with those generally dry, cold soils. It's not until you get the moisture and the warm soils in the spring that that sulfur is going to be starting to become available. The other sources of gypsum are drywall dust. I haven't worked with it. I've heard that it best way to work with it is to mix it with compost or manure so you can mitigate all the extremely fine particles that can disappear when you're applying it through a spin spreader or a manure spreader. The other sources of gypsum is, so that's a mine gypsum that I'm using. Another source of gypsum is called FGD gypsum or flue gas desulfurization gypsum. This is what they take from scrubber stacks. So one of the products on the market is called Sulphur Plus. Great product, wonderful gypsum source. It is a bit of a premium product. So if you're looking for high application rates of calcium sulfate, not the product to go with there, but it's a great product to work with as a gypsum source as well in the market. Any other questions about gypsum and why I switched to gypsum on our farm as a sulfur source?
Excuse me, Brett, you have a question in a chat room as well, please.
Okay, which one's the Q&A or the chat room?
Chat
Oh,
room,
there's
please.
chat. Okay. Look at all these different options. This is the first time I've ever done a webinar. Hey, I know that guy. I've heard that an application of calcium can help solenitic soils until you have a real wet year, unless you have real good drainage. Would installing tile help, or would that likely be cost prohibitive in this area? No, that would be excellent. What you need to do when you're trying to manage solenitic soils or high sodium content soils is you have a high water table. So every time you have evaporation coming out of the soil, which is what we're having right now with the sun beating down and it's windy, there's nothing growing, you're having evaporative losses. The moisture is going to bring sodium that's in soil solution up to the surface, and you get that white deposition on the surface. What you're going to try to do is apply gypsum, and then I'm trying to not talk using my hands here, but it'll help. Apply gypsum. That calcium is going to displace the sodium into the soil solution, but that sodium is still there in the soil solution unless you can remove the moisture from the soil profile. Now, not only is that's the first step in mitigating high sodium or saline content soils, the second part is you need to get something growing there to manage that evaporative loss or that transpiration of moisture up through the soil profile. So apply gypsum, try to do some sort of drainage to manage that high water table, and then try to get something growing there that's that's salt tolerant or can at least cover the surface, perhaps even spreading mulch, spreading compost, things like that, just to try to reduce the amount of evaporation you have coming out of the soil. But yeah, definitely reach out to me if that doesn't answer your question entirely. Next question, can you use gypsum anytime during the growing season? You can. I don't know how you're going to apply it unless you've got an applicator that can go in season, or if you're growing things like turf, golf courses, especially golf courses. I think it's a great fit for golf courses where they're trying to make sure that they don't have compaction or they don't have parts of their fairways and their greens. I don't know much about greens, but definitely the fairways where you have water ponding. Obviously, the golfers don't want to manage that, and you want to get the water out of away and down into the soil. Gypsum's going to be a benefit there. So if you have the equipment to apply it in season, definitely a good option. There is companies that have worked with liquid gypsum. I haven't. I think there's some opportunity there, but I don't know what the concentration is going to look like. One thing that I didn't refer back to, I'll just go back to it here, is gypsum is generally 21% calcium, 17% sulfur. So it is a high sulfur source fertilizer, obviously not as high as elemental sulfur, but it is going to become available within the year of application. I have had a lot of questions in the past about what the release curve is for gypsum. And I haven't done enough research on that to guarantee that, but I can verify for you that from the soil sampling and the tissue sampling that I've done with gypsum applications, the plants were sufficient with sulfur. Sulfur was not limited with gypsum applications. So I don't know the exact amount of days that it's going to take to release all that sulfur, but I have seen where sulfur is not deficient when you're using gypsum as a sulfur source. Any other questions? Chat, questions, anything? If not, I will move on to the next step. Khalil, good to go?
Yes, sir. Go ahead, please.
Okay, let's do a little water break. Beautiful weather to get the equipment ready. It's just fantastic right now. Just must be it's like in farming in southern Alberta where you spend all day getting equipment ready and you just start seeding anytime you want instead of fighting snowdrifts and slough pumps. Okay, on to my next passion, integrated pest management, mainly focusing on weeds. So to start this presentation off, I'm going to refer to the herbicide resistance management triangle. If you don't know what this triangle is, I'm very fortunate to get to teach you about it, but I'm disappointed that you all already don't know about it. Now, what it talks about is at the top of the pyramid is your highest risk resistance products, is their single mode of action herbicides. And that's your group 1 and your group 2. Very high risk products for developing resistance. This research was done from Hugh Becky, and it shows how in less than 10 applications, you can have herbicide resistance. So if you're growing wheat canola and you spray Axial and then you spray Centurion on if you spray Axial on your wheat and then you spray Centurion on your canola, you keep doing that 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you could have completely resistant wild oats. Now, I'd like to refer to the picture on the left. This is a great example of herbicide resistance. This is a wheat crop on our farm, on my field, on faba bean stubble that was pre-burned with Express Pro last spring. If you can see in the picture, there's some tiny little sick hemp nettle, and there's some extremely healthy large hemp nettle. So those hemp nettle are completely group 2 resistant. Any group 2 herbicide that I try to spray for hemp nettle will not be effective on that population. The other thing that I'd like to refer to or bring up to attention, if you haven't heard, it was on Twitter here last week. Rothamsted Research in the UK is a very, very long-standing research site. And they have found that the competition for your crop yield from weeds is now more detrimental than what it was before the use of herbicides. So we now have herbicides, which is something that farmers back before the 1960s would have loved to use. And the weed competition and the loss of yield is higher from the weeds that we have compared to pre-herbicide use. And one of the things that they referred to is the fact that we're focusing on growing shorter standing crops. So weeds have the ability to grow taller than the crops that we grow. And the representation they use here in the imagery is how top left is crops they would have grown in the wheat varieties they would have grown in the 1960s, and bottom and the progression over the years, and bottom right is wheat varieties that are currently be growing in the UK. So very short varieties. And the weeds that we've slowly over time selected for with our farming practices are more responsive to high application rates of nitrogen, which is why we grow short or semi-dwarf cereal varieties so that we can apply high nitrogen applications. So herbicide resistance is a very important topic because the weeds that we have now, if you can't control them with a herbicide, they're going to take more of your yield than ever before. So best thing to do is some proactive planning. Utilize pre-seed or pre-emergence herbicides that have a mode of action you can't use in crop or that you have never previously used before. Next step is to be rotating your active ingredients, and these are effective active ingredients. Remember, if I tank mix on that field where I have group 2 resistant hemp nettle, if I'm tank mixing a group 2 with something else, that group 2 does not count as an effective tank mix. And make sure that when you're spraying a crop multiple times throughout the year, you are using different active ingredients. So for example, would be, now Roundup Ready canola is a tough one because of the fact that I don't know of many people that are going out there and mixing a group 1 herbicide with their Roundup when they spray canola for wild oats. But what you could do is utilize products like Lontrell for thistle or wild buckwheat management. But canola, fortunately enough, we're able to utilize a few different tank mix options when you're growing Liberty Link, and then when you're growing Roundup Ready, there is tank mix options, but it's not quite as popular yet as what it is in the States. But in your cereal crops and your pulse crops, it's definitely important to be using multi-mode of action products and to be tank mixing and changing up your active ingredient throughout the growing season. And if you're dealing with an agronomist, or if you are an agronomist, I would highly recommend learning what active ingredients are controlling what weeds so that you know how to properly tank mix and how to properly rotate herbicides. Now, the next thing I was going to talk about, especially when it comes to pre-burn or non-in-crop herbicide options, is I think we're going to be utilizing more group 14s and group 15s just because these active ingredients are effective on a lot of group 2 resistant weeds or group 9 resistant weeds. For example, kochia. Fortunately, I've never found kochia on our farm, and I hope it stays that way. The next thing I want to focus on is, no pun intended, group 15 peroxysulfone. There's a lot of products on the market where they've taken a group 14 and they've added this group 15 peroxysulfone into it. So what you get now is you get a soil active residual herbicide that has activity on group 2 resistant broadleaf weeds, group 9 resistant broadleaf weeds, and it also has activity on group 1 resistant wild oats and group 2 resistant wild oats. The other thing that is going to be that I think a farmer and on our own farm try to utilize more is those old active ingredients like Edge, Avidex, Treflan, Sencor, things like that haven't been used in a long time and are very effective on certain weeds in your weed spectrum. Here's some visual aids on products just for those that prefer to see a little bit of a representation to color it up. The difficulty with some of these products is that you can only tank mix them with certain actives, or for example, Sencor. Unless you're growing potatoes, there's nothing really that you can tank mix it with to spray in crop. So it's a single pass product that's only going to be effective on a certain number of broadleaf weeds, and it's quite selective. Or they're granular products, which aren't as easy to work with either. Here's some trials that we did. This is on faba beans, and we had the applicator had a issue where half of the metering system on the 70-foot boom wasn't metering half of the applicator, and so we had a check strip where there was no edge applied, and right next to it was where we had edge applied. And what was done is after the faba beans were seeded, just did a shot of Roundup for anything that came up after the faba beans were seeded, and that just straight Roundup did nothing to the wild oats. They must have all emerged afterwards, whereas the Edge was able to keep the wild oats under control significantly. And that's our check strip there. Here's just a bit of a representation on these soil residual active herbicides, either granular or liquid. Lots of the times your weeds will still emerge. They're not 100% effective, but what they definitely can help with is they'll keep your weeds at a stage that's small enough that your crop can either outcompete them, or if they're not completely herbicide resistant, they're very easy to control with your in-crop herbicide. So there's a little bit different expectations that you need to plan in using these products, because they're not just something that you can spray and it's going to control everything, which is unfortunate because they are the most expensive products per acre that you can use, and they're probably the least consistently effective compared to your in-crop herbicides. But those highly effective in-crop herbicides all of a sudden will become ineffective on certain weeds at a very short period of time after prolonged use of the same herbicides. And mostly I'm talking about group 1 and 2 use on wild oats and group 2 herbicide use on broadleaf weeds. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that when you are using herbicides, you want to make sure that you're not selecting for sublethal dose or low rate application that's below the labeled rate, because there has been a lot of research that's been shown that a low rate application of herbicide can add selection pressure to resistant varieties or resistant biotypes. And so what I would highly recommend is doing a water test with the herbicides that or with your spray water, so that you can make sure none of your active ingredients are being tied up. So if you have high bicarbonates in your water, calcium, iron, sodium, you should be softening or managing or treating that water with an ammonium sulfate liquid product or a pH adjuster. I'm more of a fan of an ammonium sulfate to tie up the bicarbonates than a pH adjuster, just because of the fact that a lot of the herbicides that we use are acidic already to begin with. So that's just the research that I've done and some of the trials that I've done. There's probably a lot of agronomists out there that have done more work with pH adjusters and they think that those work better. But I feel that ammonium sulfate water conditioning for high bicarbonate water is an effective way to manage the amount of cations in your water. The other thing is if you're using something like a dugout for your water source, You need to be very diligent on screening, straining, and filtering that water so you don't have any turbidity or dissolved solids, because that is bad for tying up active ingredients, especially Roundup. Roundup's very susceptible, as we all know, to any turbidity in the water and it being tied up. Use a pH adjuster if you need to increase the pH with a product like Finish. Chalcoxidum or liquid Achieve goes into solution better at a basic pH. So use something like Finish to improve the solubility of that product, so you're making sure that the active ingredients you're putting through your sprayer are going on, hitting the target at the rate you want. Making sure that you're using the right nozzle, the right pressure to get the exact size of droplet that's going to give you the best amount of percent hit or accuracy on the target of the weed that you're shooting for. Majority of the time, you're going to be spraying in the coarse to very coarse. A medium spray gives you great coverage, but it's pretty drifty, especially depending on how many fine particles is being created out of your droplet. So majority of the time, you're going to be spraying from a coarse to a very coarse droplet. And if you're worried about making sure you do a good job, use a coarse droplet or a very coarse nozzle, and increase your water volume to increase the amount of droplets that you're applying. Carry your booms low. You want good coverage, so you don't want your booms up in the air where all your driftable fines are increased on how far they're going to travel off target. Another thing is to use the correct surfactant or adjuvant that's on label to make sure that that active ingredient that you applied is effectively getting into the plant. Another thing that I was fortunate enough to do some research with was working with drift reduction technology products like Interlock and LI700 with LessiTech technology, so that you can take the driftable fines that are produced by your nozzle, which there's a certain percentage of driftable fines that are produced by every single nozzle. There's nothing you can do about it unless you add a product like Interlock or something with LessiTech technology that will reduce the amount of driftable fines, so that once again you can have less off-target application and a better job of making sure there's more active ingredient that you're applying getting on target. In the future, variable rate herbicide applications, so that you can start managing those high cost per acre herbicides and go out there and just selectively spray spots in the field that are a problem, or perhaps go in with a labeled low rate, but also an on-label high rate to give you either more effective control on hard to control weeds. Also utilizing direct inject. I think there's a ton of opportunity there to be working with products like that, so that you can take a very expensive active ingredient and be spraying your field and just be able to direct inject it based on a variable rate prescription or a weed technology, where you can reduce the amount of cost per acre in that expensive product by just putting it where it belongs. This weeded technology, I think, is going to be very important in helping farmers to use expensive, effective quality active ingredients, but not putting it on every acre, so that you don't have to manage that cost on acres that don't require that active. And here's another one that I think kind of ties back to gypsum and sodium management in zones of your field that are difficult to get a good competitive crop stand or a nice plant stand, is using variable rate fertility and variable rate seeding. Now, variable rate fertility, Rothamsted research showed how the weeds that we have now are more responsive and more competitive with the higher application of nitrogen rates that we're using. So if you've got a part of the field that has a low yield potential because of the fact it's high sodium, or it's a hilltop, or just for some reason sandy, whatever it is, you don't have a good yield potential there, you should be decreasing the amount of nitrogen in that zone. Otherwise, you're just feeding those weeds that are very difficult to control, and they're going to be perfectly fine in that sandy soil or that hilltop or that high sodium content because they've adapted to grow there, and you're just giving them extra nitrogen to outcompete your crop and make it more difficult for your herbicide to, especially to try to get those weeds on in the stage that you need when you're feeding it nitrogen and you have a poor crop competition. So decrease your nitrogen in those zones of the field that where the weed or the yield potential is not there, and increase your seeding rate if you want to have better crop competition, especially high sodium zones, high magnesium zones. If it's dry year hilltops, increase your seeding rate so that you can have a more competitive crop stand to be able to manage those weeds and not rely so much on your herbicide, but get your crop to outcompete those weeds. Now, when it comes to, I'd like to ask the crowd a question. Brianne Tiedemann had kind of mentioned that this maybe or maybe won't work in the future. Unfortunately, as we all know, we weren't able to attend any good events other than these webinar-based ones to learn more about herbicide resistance management. But my question is, are we going to start using Group 1 and Group 2 tank mixes in crop on cereals? Odyssey DLX is a product that's been around for a long time on pulse crops. It has a Group 1 and a Group 2 grassy weed control in it. Are we going to have to start doing things like that in our cereal crops? I hope not, because that'll double your cost per acre on your wild oat herbicide. And sorry, I thought I put that on. I did put it on Do Not Disturb. Why that happened? Apologize. Another question for the crowd: is anyone dealing with high wild oat resistance? I definitely am dealing with wild oat herbicide resistance on our farm, and so I'm looking at utilizing the Group 15 active ingredient in front of the pulses and potentially in front of some of the wheat, and potentially Avidex in front of the barley, just to try to change it up a bit. So now in extreme situations, you've reached the point where you do not have the ability to control a heavily infested population of weeds with herbicides at your disposal. You now need to change it up. One thing I should have contained in this presentation is the Burgo weed clipper, so that you can cut weeds that are taller than your crop before they set seed. So that's definitely another mode of action to manage weeds. But now you need to change the game. If herbicides aren't working anymore, you need to look at diversifying your crop rotation so that you're able to use different active ingredients. You're changing up your crop competition, and you're changing your time of harvest and time of seeding. And you also need to, if it's extreme enough, you need to start looking at forage crops so that you can cut your crop before the weeds have set seed, or look at cover crops to increase the amount of competition you have and be able to utilize different methods of competition between varieties or crops or biotypes that are covering the ground for competition, and then growing crops that are very tall to offset any competition you have from weeds that are able to outgrow the height of your crop. On our farm, I'm hoping that at one point we can start incorporating winter annuals for wild oat resistance management, because I've seen that farmers who are able to get a good fall rye establishment pretty much have no wild oat issues. It's amazing how competitive that crop is for eradicating any wild oats from popping their heads up.